Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're on, well, a pretty essential mission.
I think so.
We're trying to identify the fundamental flaws in our modern economic operating system and, more importantly, chart a course towards something that actually works.
Something aligned with science.
Exactly. Not assumptions that are, centuries old now. I mean, if you feel like global events are just spinning out of control.
Which I think a lot of us do.
Right. The climate crisis, inequality, political polarization. It's because they are profoundly interconnected. This deep, persistent entanglement of breakdowns, ecological, economic, social, has a name. It's been dubbed the Polycrisis.
And that feeling of everything speeding up, of this incredible complexity, it's not an accident. And you certainly can't solve it with, small incremental fixes.
Then tweaks here and there?
No. The source material we're looking at argues, and I think really compellingly, that we are not just living in an era of change. We're not just managing fluctuations within a stable system. We are experiencing a change in era. And that demands a foundational transformation of our economic system, a move away from these flawed historical ideas and toward, the verifiable principles of living systems science.
And that transformation, it has to start with recognizing the central conflict.
Yeah.
The one that dictates almost every policy decision made today. Our current global economic architecture is specifically engineered for one thing: perpetual exponential material growth.
Right.
But the operating environment, planet Earth, is finite. That's it. That's the original premise that our sources call the original error. It's right at the heart of the Polycrisis.
Yes, and I think for this deep dive, the most insightful takeaway is realizing where this error actually comes from. If you trace that belief in infinite growth and, mechanical control back to its deepest root,
what do you find?
It really boils down to the myth of separation.
Separation.
Yeah. This deeply ingrained philosophical belief that we are somehow independent, separate from each other, and fundamentally separate from nature itself. It's this illusion of isolation that drives all the extractive behavior.
I love how the sources challenge that whole idea, that industrial, isolated identity we've all inherited. The idea of the sovereign individual. They pose this deceptively simple question.
It's a great one.
Where is the edge of me?
It's just a beautifully provocative question, isn't it? Because it instantly collapses the certainty of those rigid boundaries we imagine.
Right.
I mean, is the edge of you your skin? Biologically, no. You're an ecosystem of trillions of cells, a thriving microbiome, all working together. Is it your national border?
Economically, no way.
Of course not.
Yeah.
Your prosperity depends on global supply chains, on co-inherited infrastructure, on knowledge passed down for generations. Your identity is a flow network, not some fixed point in space.
So when you ask that question, all the rigid lines that our economic models draw,
they just dissolve.
The line between self and other, or the economy and the environment.
They're exposed as what they are. Arbitrary and, frankly, dangerous artifacts of a specific outdated philosophy. We aren't just connected. The science confirms we are profoundly interdependent, and our economy, it has to start reflecting that truth.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's pull apart the engine of the current system and understand exactly where this myth of separation was engineered into the economy.
Let's do it.
The sources explain that the predominant free market system is fundamentally trapped in what they call the clockwork universe worldview.
The clockwork universe, it's a great metaphor.
It treats organizations, people, the entire global economy as complicated, predictable machines.
This is the core mechanistic worldview. It's the assumption that if we just get the data right, we can model everything. We can optimize and forecast these machines with purely reductionist, often very left-brain-centered thinking.
Just find the right inputs for the right outputs.
Exactly. It's the idea that if a system is complicated enough, we can build a perfect instruction manual, optimize it for efficiency, and then the outcome we want is basically guaranteed.
Right.
The tragedy is that we are trying to run a highly complex living organism, the global economy, with a philosophy that was designed for a wind-up toy.
And this error, the sources suggest, it traces back directly to a massive oversimplification and a really narrow interpretation of Adam Smith's most famous metaphor.
The invisible hand.
The invisible hand. We've isolated and basically enshrined self-interest as the sole driver of market efficiency.
And that abstraction is the historical crime, so to speak. Everyone knows the quote about the butcher and the baker acting on self-interest.
Sure.
But the crucial context is almost universally ignored in modern economic teaching. Smith was an Enlightenment moral philosopher, first and foremost.
Right, not just an economist.
He set the invisible hand in a moral framework he defined years earlier in his huge work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And in it, he used the word sympathy, which, in 18th century language, translates directly to what we now call empathy, the capacity to understand and share the feelings of another.
Wait a second. So if the intellectual father of capitalism, Adam Smith himself, built his entire system on empathy, how did modern economics just strip out that moral foundation so completely? I mean, to the point where we end up with the Gordon Gekko greed is good model.
Well, it happened through a long historical process of abstraction and the professionalization of the field. As economics tried to become a hard science in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it had to cut out anything that seemed soft or subjective.
Like morality.
Exactly, like morality or context or relationships. And once you lose those necessary moral and relational anchors, the empathy that's required for a society to function, the system itself inherently becomes incapable of solving complex, what they call divergent problems.
Okay, can you elaborate on that? What's a divergent problem, and why does our current system just fail to handle it?
Sure. So most technical or complicated problems are convergent. They have one optimal answer. How do you build a microchip? How do you calculate a rocket's trajectory? Reductionist logic is fantastic at these.
A single best solution.
Right. But divergent problems like solving climate change or balancing justice versus mercy or finding the equilibrium between freedom and order, they don't have a neat mathematical solution. They require continuous synthesis, judgment, relational wisdom.
And the mechanistic invisible hand system.
It was designed for convergence and optimization, so it simply crashes when it's faced with genuine complexity.
Yeah.
You cannot solve exploding inequality or global warming by just relying on self-interest. And you can't solve it by imposing rigid top-down bureaucratic control either. We need a system that can transcend the very reductionist logic that created the problem in the first place.
This is where the deep dive into the historical flaw gets truly staggering. I mean, it's almost unbelievable. The sources argue that classical and neoclassical economics were built on this incredible assumption.
Physics envy.
That economic principles should parallel the laws of Newtonian physics. This is the Newtonian error.
It is the foundational, profound, and often lethal error. Economists of that era, they really suffered from what you could call physics envy. They watched Newtonian physics successfully model the physical world with mathematics and just assumed they could apply the same mathematical rigor to social systems.
A huge leap.
A huge, incorrect leap. They believed the universe of human exchange operated like a deterministic clockwork mechanism. A key figure in formalizing this error was the American economist Irving Fisher.
And the sources provide his actual table of correspondences, which just lays bare the irrational assumptions you have to make to force this parallel. What were the most damaging assumptions he made to map the social world onto the physical world?
Well, to achieve that mathematical rigor, he had to formalize separation. He needed to force a precise mathematical correspondence. And the sources highlight his first one. He assumed a particle in mechanics must correspond to an individual in economics.
Just that one correspondence alone formalizes the atomization of society. It treats us all like disconnected billiard balls.
Precisely. This model formalizes the idea that humans are disconnected, self-interested particles just optimizing for their own separate gain. It justifies what the profession calls the rational economic man.
Right.
And that gives formal mathematical justification for greed being good. It's buried in dense, authoritative-looking textbooks for a century. It's the engine of separation, codified into math.
That's devastating. And there's a second correspondence that is just as startling, and it relates to labor.
Yes. So Fisher needed a correspondent for work in mechanics. He landed on work in mechanics corresponding to disutility in economics.
Disutility, meaning work is inherently something negative, a bad thing.
Exactly. The implication embedded in the economic equations is that work is something we only endure to get money. It's something we inherently want to minimize. So the system is designed around optimizing for as little work as possible.
Wow.
Think about the cultural and policy implications of that mathematical axiom. It strips away any sense of purpose, meaning, or dignity inherent in labor. It treats humans as inputs to be minimized, reducing labor to a cost to be cut, rather than an essential creative contribution to the whole. This single assumption has dictated labor policy and corporate behavior for generations, justifying layoffs, automation purely for cost reduction, and the erosion of worker rights, all because the foundational math declared work to be inherently bad.
So even as new economic schools came along, like Keynesian or behavioral economics, they were essentially just trying to slap patches onto this fundamentally cracked Newtonian foundation.
They were trying to fix the symptoms without ever curing the disease. Keynesian economics, which was essential after the Great Depression, was a vital patch. It addressed demand failure. But it left the Newtonian clockwork assumptions about the individual and the nature of value completely untouched. Behavioral economics came along to address the, frankly, ridiculous assumption that humans are purely utility-maximizing machines.
The rational economic man again.
Right. They proved people actually hold other values, like fairness or social good. Another patch. But it didn't change the underlying physics framework.
And environmental economics.
Yeah.
It reduced the greatest existential threat we face, the climate crisis, to what?
To a mere externality.
An externality.
They defined climate change as a cost that's not fully priced into the market system. Something that, in theory, can be fixed with a mechanism like a carbon tax.
Which isn't a bad idea in itself.
No, a carbon tax is smart public policy, but treating the wholesale destruction of the biosphere as an externality is a profound intellectual and moral failure. The sources cite Peter Brown, who says it so wisely. There's a difference between a cost that can be fixed with money and a wrong that can never be fixed. You can't put a price on the irreversible loss of a species or the collapse of a habitable climate.
Because none of these patches, none of them addressed the two core, fatally flawed beliefs inherited from that Newtonian framework.
Precisely. The first fatal flaw they failed to eliminate is the belief that the economy is somehow separate from the biosphere, an assumption that is contradicted not only by ecology, but by modern quantum physics and, basic common sense.
And the second one?
The second, and perhaps the most physically destructive, is the belief that continuous exponential material growth on a finite planet is physically possible. This directly violates the entropy law from physics, the second law of thermodynamics. Neoclassical economics, therefore, is fundamentally incompatible with verifiable modern science, yet it still dictates global policy.
And the ultimate danger of this relentless, dogma-driven pursuit of growth is, well, it's chillingly illustrated by the sources through the case of economist William Nordhaus and his famous DICE model.
This is truly critical to understand the lock-in. Nordhaus, who won the Economic Prize in honor of Alfred Nobel in 2018, famously concluded through his modeling that we should actually target 3.5 degrees Celsius of warming.
3.5 degrees. I mean, that's catastrophic.
It is. And why? Because achieving the scientifically required target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, the level scientists agree is necessary to prevent runaway catastrophic change, would simply cost too much in terms of foregone economic growth.
That is shocking. He is deliberately choosing a path guaranteed to cause humanitarian and ecological disaster because the short-term cost of avoiding it interferes with the sacred cow of growth.
It illustrates the deep theoretical lock-in of this mechanistic paradigm. Nordhaus's logic is reductionist, it's growth-obsessed, and at the end of the day, it's suicidal. His model assumes that future economic growth will generate enough wealth, more money, to fix the climate problems later.
A belief in a technological fix that will just magically appear.
Right, even though the scientific consensus is screaming that we must stay below 1.5 degrees now to preserve any kind of system stability. It's a perfect example of how a core identity rooted in this flawed paradigm, the belief that the market solves all, can prevent highly intelligent people from accepting reality when that reality challenges their fundamental worldview. The cost of changing the paradigm is perceived as greater than the cost of ecological collapse.
Okay, so if we accept that the mechanistic machine metaphor is not only bankrupt, but actively dangerous, then the necessary replacement has to be a living systems worldview.
It's the only way forward. We have to embrace the science of interdependence. And the foundation of this shift is the concept of holism, which was formally introduced by Jan Smuts way back in 1926. It's an intellectual anchor for the entire regenerative paradigm.
So what does holism fundamentally define? I mean, beyond just being the opposite of reductionism.
Smuts defined it as the tendency in nature to form wholes that are greater than the sum of the parts through creative evolution. It's all about emergence. Think of a simple chemical example. Hydrogen plus oxygen doesn't just equal a mixture of gases. It creates water, a new whole, with completely new emergent properties. Or the human body, which is vastly greater than the sum of its individual cells, organs, and systems. This tendency toward organizing into ever more complex, interdependent wholes is what drives creative evolutionary processes in all flow networks, whether they're living or non-living.
So this requires us to consciously separate the kind of problems that reductionist logic is good at from those that demand a holistic lens.
Absolutely. We need to be rigorous about distinguishing between what is merely complicated and what is genuinely complex.
What's the difference?
Complicated things like engines, rocket ships, or microchips are excellent subjects for reductionist logic. If they break, you can disassemble them, fix the broken part, and then reassemble them. You don't need holistic thinking.
But complex systems don't work like that.
Not at all. Complex systems like human health, organizations, ecosystems, or economies are characterized by nonlinear relationships, feedback loops, and emergent properties. If you try to manage the complexity of human health or a regional economy using reductionist logic designed for a machine,
You're going to break something else.
you inevitably miss the key relational dynamics and you accelerate instability, which is exactly how we arrived at the Polycrisis. Holistic thinking is required for complex systems. Reductionist logic is for complicated ones. Mixing the two is fatal.
Speaking of complexity, let's address that profound misinterpretation of evolution. The one that's been co-opted by social Darwinists to justify hypercompetition. I'm talking about survival of the fittest.
The sources are so clear on this. This interpretation is a purposeful misconstruction, used primarily to rationalize antisocial behavior within capitalism. Darwin was actually referring to the species that best fits its particular highly localized environment. And often that means finding a niche that avoids head-to-head competition. Modern biologists now emphasize that life is a team sport.
So collaboration, not competition, is the superior survival mechanism in mature, sustainable natural systems.
That's the key insight. Organisms evolve out of competition where possible because competition is incredibly wasteful and detrimental to all parties involved, including the so-called victor.
Can you give an example?
Sure, think about the difference between weeds and a rainforest. Weeds are highly competitive. They exhaust the soil rapidly, leading to quick death for the whole patch. A rainforest, by contrast, is a mature, resilient, sustainable system built on continuous, deep-seated collaboration. Trees share nutrients through underground fungal networks. Everything is designed to maximize the health of the entire ecosystem.
And the giraffe?
The giraffe is a perfect example. It didn't evolve a long neck to win a fight against the zebra for food. It evolved that neck to reach higher foliage and avoid competing with the zebra for ground-level resources. It evolved out of the competitive dynamic.
The ultimate holistic context for the human economy, then, must be the planet itself.
Yeah. That brings us to the Gaia hypothesis, popularized by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. The planet, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the biosphere, and all the great biogeochemical cycles is a self-organizing, self-maintaining living system, a Gaiasphere. When we conceptualize our economic system, we have to use the fractal model of wholes embedded within wholes.
Okay, walk us through that nesting, because it visually clarifies the systemic error of that old Newtonian framework.
You start at the largest scale, the biosphere and the fundamental laws of physics. Embedded within that is society, our human culture, institutions, our population. And embedded within society is the economy, the system of production and consumption. And nested deep inside all of that is the financial system, which is essentially just the accounting mechanism for transactions.
And the failure of modern economics.
The profound failure is its refusal to acknowledge this reality. It treats the financial system and the economy as if they exist outside, or, even worse, above the biosphere. Any damage we inflict at that largest scale, the biosphere, inevitably ripples back to harm every single part inside it, including the individual corporation and the individual bank account. We are not just dependent on the biosphere, we are embedded in it.
And this shift finally aligns us with verifiable natural principles, like the ones summarized by Fritjof Capra.
Yes, Capra's first principles of life, they really inform the entire regenerative paradigm. Life is inherently regenerative, it's always renewing itself, it is creative, constantly seeking new solutions, and it is intelligent, organized around self-maintenance and self-correction. Our economy shouldn't be a counterforce to these principles, it should be a conscious, creative expression of them.
So if the ecological mind has to replace the industrial mind, we need a new operating system. The sources introduce these 8 first principles of regenerative vitality, which act as a kind of blueprint for designing healthy, complex living systems.
And it's really crucial to understand the mindset shift here. We're not setting tidy, mechanistic targets like achieve 3% GDP growth.
Right.
We are creating conditions for unseen potential for emergence to occur. The goal is vitality. And these 8 principles are not an a la carte menu. They're all interrelated, they're context-specific, and they must all be honored simultaneously for the system to achieve true systemic health.
Okay, let's start with the first principle. Operates in right relationship. How does a regenerative economy even define right relationship?
It means acting in ways that consistently serve the long-term health and vitality of the whole system. That's the operational definition of fitness in an interdependent world. In a conventional economy, an exchange is judged solely on efficiency. Did I make a profit?
That's it.
In a regenerative economy, the exchange must be anchored in healthy symbiotic relationships.
Can you provide a good ecological example of that kind of symbiotic value-adding relationship?
The source uses a great one, the salmon and the river forest system. Salmon are not just a commodity to be extracted. They live in the ocean, they return to the river, they spawn, and they die. Their bodies transfer massive amounts of marine nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus deep into the forest ecosystem.
Through bears, birds.
Exactly. Bears, birds, insects. Those nutrients feed the trees, which stabilize the riverbanks, which in turn keeps the water cool and clean for the young salmon. This is a complex, multi-species, value-adding exchange where all parties, the river, the forest, the salmon, the bears, and ultimately us all benefit. That reciprocal flow is the essence of right relationship.
And this has to be applied across all scales using fractal patterns. What happens when we violate this at the smaller scales?
Well, health requires nested relationships across all scales: individual, family, community, region, global, biosphere.
Yeah.
If you relentlessly undermine small-scale local economies, for instance, if a massive retailer like Walmart squeezes its thousands of small suppliers for every last bit of margin,
Demanding lower and lower prices.
right, you undermine the financial and social health of those smaller communities. Those communities falter, which then reduces the overall resilience of the larger national system. The system is only as strong as its weakest link. Undermining the small scale harms the larger whole.
The second principle is a profound intellectual challenge to conventional thinking. Views wealth holistically.
Yes. Since we're moving beyond the reductionist focus on just financial capital, we have to redefine value in terms of the well-being of the whole. This means harmonizing and accounting for multiple forms of capital.
Yeah.
The sources identify 8 forms of capital far beyond just money and buildings.
Okay, can you quickly summarize those 8 forms of capital that have to be managed holistically?
They are financial capital, which is money and instruments; material capital, so infrastructure and produced goods; then living capital, which is natural resources and ecosystems; social capital, which is relationships, networks, and trust; cultural capital, our shared knowledge and heritage; experiential capital, which is lived wisdom and skills; intellectual capital, like patents and R&D; and finally, spiritual capital, our sense of meaning and purpose. A company or a community is only truly wealthy if it is growing its living, social, and cultural capital right alongside its financial and material capital.
That requires a monumental shift in the corporate mindset, though, moving from this dogma of scarcity to an ethic of sufficiency.
Absolutely. The conventional mindset is never enough, and it's driven by the fear of scarcity. The regenerative mindset moves to sufficiency. Once basic material and financial needs are demonstrably met, the creation of social capital like building community trust and the restoration of natural capital like reforesting a watershed must be explicitly valued above the endless, marginal accumulation of more financial capital. The very definition of organizational and personal success fundamentally transforms beyond just material wealth accumulation.
Okay, next up, innovates, adapts, responds. How does a regenerative system ensure continuous adaptation and flexibility?
Innovation has to be driven by what's essential to the health of the whole, not merely endless convenience or maximizing extraction. And crucially, this requires systems to be decentralized.
Why decentralized?
Because centralized, rigid hierarchies, the kind you find in huge state bureaucracies or behemoth global corporations, conflict directly with the need to adapt quickly to localized changes in the environment or the market. Life is decentralized. Its nervous system is distributed. A centralized system, when it gets hit by a shock, tends to break catastrophically rather than flex and adapt.
And we see the current economic flaw when individual firms substitute people with software or robots purely for that short-term margin improvement.
It's a classic failure of reductionist logic. A firm substitutes software for human employees, and sure, its margins increase, but they completely ignore the social cost.
Which is
Structural unemployment, weakened community, decreased public services. That cost doesn't just disappear, it gets externalized onto society. And then it ripples back as weakened demand for their products, social instability, and deteriorating infrastructure. So from a holistic view, the firm hasn't optimized for success. It has just shifted the burden, ultimately damaging the very system it relies on.
Principle 4. Ensures empowered participation. This seems to directly address that Newtonian error of seeing people as just particles.
It is the systemic requirement that every single part of the system matters and has agency. All parts must be in relationship with the larger whole, both negotiating for their own needs and contributing their unique value. The health and the potential of the economy are entirely dependent on harnessing the unique talents and contributions of everyone. If people are marginalized, the system loses vitality.
The sources make a really strong case that extreme inequality is not just an ethical issue, but a scientific requirement for systemic health. Can you elaborate on the evidence for that?
Yes, the seminal research by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett demonstrates this so clearly. Their work shows that high inequality societies, like the US and the UK, perform significantly worse on a long list of health and social problems, from crime rates and teen pregnancy to educational outcomes and mental illness, than more equal societies like Norway or Japan.
And this affects everyone, not just the people at the bottom.
That's the crucial part. This degradation affects everyone, even the well-off within those countries.
So restraining extreme wealth and ensuring universal access to basic needs isn't some form of socialism. It's a structural necessity for a healthy, functioning system.
Exactly. It makes the economic case for universal access to quality healthcare, education, clean water, and housing. These aren't just rights, they are mechanisms that enable everyone to stabilize, gain skills, and contribute their unique talents to the whole. Inequality is therefore a self-inflicted systemic harm that suppresses the system's creative potential.
Moving on to honors community and place. This seems to stand in direct opposition to the homogenization of globalization.
It does. The relentless drive for scale in global corporate capitalism often leads to cultural and ecological monoculture. Unique local cultures and places are essentially desecrated through standardization. Think of a Starbucks, a Walmart, or an Amazon fulfillment center, replacing distinct local businesses worldwide. Regenerative economies must, conversely, build resilience that's rooted in the distinctive culture, history, and ecological potential of their specific bioregions.
But does this mean global corporations can't exist in a regenerative economy?
Not at all, but they have to be place-sourced and operate with a relational mindset. The sources cite the example of DNV GL, the global Norwegian certification and risk management company.
Okay.
Even with offices in over 100 countries, it remains true to its Norwegian culture, which prioritizes ethics, long-term thinking, and deep employee loyalty. Furthermore, they operate close to their customers in local offices for deep community context, rather than adopting that empire-building extractive mentality that justifies exploiting local resources solely for distant shareholder gain.
Principle 6. Discovers edge effect abundance. This is a beautiful concept.
It is. This principle recognizes that creativity and true synergy emerge best not at the stable center of systems, but at the edges, the dynamic interfaces where diversity and cross-fertilization naturally occur.
Like an estuary.
Exactly. Think of an estuary where the river meets the ocean, mixing fresh and salt water. They are some of the most bioabundant ecosystems on Earth. In economic terms, these edges are where the bonds holding the dominant, often dysfunctional pattern are weakest, allowing new possibilities to emerge.
So that implies cultivating unlikely collaborations and actively seeking out difference.
Precisely. Finding common cause is a key regenerative practice. The sources mention the example of social conservatives and liberals uniting over creation care or environmentalism.
That did not work.
They find common ground because religious doctrine often demands stewardship for the vulnerable, so they can set aside their political disagreements to focus on a shared existential purpose. This type of abundance comes from synergistic collaboration, not reductionist competition.
But there's a serious warning here regarding modern technology platforms, which often operate at these edges.
Yes, this is the risk of extraction. Large platform companies like Spotify, Google, or social media networks, they become networked platforms that facilitate exchange and diversity on the edge, which is good. However, they are fundamentally managed purely to extract value for themselves from those edges.
Right.
Spotify extracts massive value from creative artists while paying them fractional returns. Google extracts our collective intelligence and data. They turn the generative power of the edge effect into a parasitic extraction model, which depletes the creative source rather than reinvesting in its health. A regenerative system has to govern these edges for the health of the whole.
Okay, principle 7. Ensures robust circulatory flow. This takes us back to that biological analogy of blood flow.
Right. The circulation of money, information, matter, and energy is vital for any living system. Stagnation is death. And this principle moves significantly beyond the current concept of a circular economy, which typically focuses only on material waste, the goal of reducing the take-make-waste cycle.
And the regenerative goal is a true metabolic economy. How do you distinguish between the two?
A metabolic economy demands a complete systemic redesign of business models where waste literally becomes food, and enterprises transition from selling polluting products like cars or heating oil to providing services in rigorously closed-loop systems. So transportation as a service or guaranteed warmth. This is a systemic overhaul.
I see.
And robust financial circulation contrasts sharply with Wall Street's short-term extraction. The sources cite DNVGL again, which is committed to reinvesting 5% of its sales in long-term R&D. That's a virtuous circulation that promotes resilience, rather than sacrificing future innovation just to boost quarterly shareholder profits.
And finally, number 8, seeks dynamic balance.
A regenerative system is a delicate and dynamic dance, much like a unicycle rider continuously adjusting, rather than a machine rigidly optimized for a single variable. Conventional economics insists on ruthlessly optimizing a single metric, typically financial efficiency or maximizing shareholder value. And this singular focus, ironically, is what destroys the system's ability to withstand shocks.
This brings us to that critical tension between efficiency and resilience.
This is a major takeaway. The relentless reductionist pursuit of efficiency, just-in-time logistics, minimal redundancies, maximizing returns, systemically destroys resilience.
We've seen this happen.
We saw this manifest catastrophically in the 2008 financial collapse, where the system was too efficient and interconnected to allow for any natural correction. We saw it again during the pandemic with the global supply chain shocks. The system was optimized for one variable cost reduction at the expense of its ability to adapt and survive.
The principle concludes by noting that system health requires explicit mechanisms to restrain concentrations of power and wealth.
It has to. System health demands mechanisms, such as aggressive inheritance taxes above a set threshold, carefully managed debt jubilees, and constraints on monopoly power, because excessive concentration of power and wealth is scientifically proven to be destructive to the whole system's vitality.
And you're saying this isn't an ideological preference?
It is not an ideological preference. It is a scientific requirement for system stability. It's about ensuring the dynamic balance isn't broken by singular gravitational concentrations of control.
Okay. We've established that the current system is built on reductionism, separation, and just plain flawed science. But if there's one institutional blind spot that prevents us from moving toward a regenerative model, what is it?
It's the vast majority of our shared wealth, what we call the commons.
The commons.
Conventional economics simply overlooks it or treats it as free or allows it to be privately expropriated. This systemic failure to govern our co-inherited wealth is why the current world order, founded largely on Bretton Woods institutions designed for the post-war industrial era, is completely unfit for the context of the Polycrisis.
Our co-inherited wealth is massive, and the sources break it down into two crucial domains.
First, there's the biosphere commons. This includes all ecosystem services, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, pollination, clean water. Rod Costanza and his colleagues provided a staggering estimate in 2014.
How much?
They valued the annual service flow of the biosphere at approximately $125 trillion. This wealth is co-inherited by all life on Earth.
$125 trillion a year. And second, there's the technosphere commons. This is the cumulative built and intellectual capital of civilization.
Right. It's the entire infrastructure we've built up. Universities, microchips, software code, legal systems, roads, scientific knowledge, the internet protocols, all the cumulative learning we inherit from the past.
And we have an estimate for that.
Nobel economist Herbert Simon famously posited that only about 20% of our wealth is actually earned by individuals. The rest, 80%, is collective patrimony associated with just being born into a productive social and intellectual system.
So if we combine Costanza's estimate for ecosystem services and Simon's estimate for technological patrimony, What portion of our total wealth does the discipline of economics actually focus on and account for?
This is the shocking conclusion. Conventional economics, which is focused obsessively on GDP and private exchange, focuses on only a tiny slice. The estimate is a mere 13% of our total wealth.
13%.
Yes, we have essentially organized global society around allocating scarce resources. That 13%, while ignoring, mismanaging, or allowing the expropriation of the vast abundance, the other 87% that is fundamental to life and civilization.
That is a profound, almost unbelievable systemic oversight. And it directly results in our global failure to manage climate change.
And that failure of perception has led directly to a failure of governance. Why? Because markets are ill-suited to managing complex, long-term, non-monetizable resources, and nation-states driven by short-term electoral cycles and national self-interest have failed miserably to manage global commons like the atmosphere, migratory species, or the global fisheries.
So the solution is not to expand the role of the market or the state, but to build a third institutional sector, the commons, complementing the private and public sectors.
This new institution would have a specific fiduciary duty to manage that co-inherited wealth, the 87%, to ensure sustainable management and equitable distribution of the surplus derived from their use.
And this isn't some vague utopian idea.
Not at all. It is a vital institutional design requirement for a regenerative economy. It's about moving management from short-term extraction to long-term stewardship. And crucially, we have a blueprint for how to govern these resources through the work of Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom.
Right. Ostrom studied existing successful common pool resource management systems all over the world. What are some of her key principles for making a commons institution actually function?
Well, her 8 design principles emphasize participatory governance and strong local oversight. Let's apply a few to that fishery example. 1. Define clear boundaries. You have to know exactly who the resource users are and what the resource is. 2. Match rules to local needs. The rules for a Pacific fishery won't work for a Mediterranean one. The local users have to participate in setting the rules.
So no one-size-fits-all.
No. 3. Participatory decision-making. Those affected by the rules must be able to participate in modifying them. 4. Graduated sanctions. Penalties for violations have to start small and then increase with severity. And importantly, 5. Subsidiarity. Decisions must be made at the lowest level possible, but not lower, and then nested within larger cooperative networks. This structure allows the commons to be managed with complexity and nuance, something the state and the market simply cannot achieve.
Okay, let's run the thought experiment for the biosphere commons, using that global fishery. How would a commons trust manage this resource sustainably and equitably?
A commons trust, operating globally and transcending national borders, would have a fiduciary duty to preserve that fishery over the long term, based purely on the best available science. Its first job would be to set science-based quotas. That's the tool of control, restraining extraction to sustainable limits.
Okay.
The trust would then sell usage permits for the sustainable surplus. And crucially, the usage fees derived from the sale of these permits would be distributed as a dividend to the co-inheritors of the resource all of humanity, or a defined region.
That instantly makes the abundance visible. It puts a price on unsustainable usage while creating an inequality neutralizing mechanism.
It incentivizes thrift and recirculates the natural abundance equitably. Now, think about the technosphere commons. The internet is a classic technological commons, built on public investment and open protocols.
Right.
Without proper governance, companies like Google, Meta, and others exploit the network effects and the data generated a co-inherited asset for massive private gain. And this exploitation is causing immense social harm, from data privacy erosion to damaging mental health and eroding democracy.
And this model suggests a clear, practical path for managing the rapid expansion of emerging technological commons, like artificial intelligence.
AI is the ultimate example of the extraction of the technosphere commons. AI, large language models, use the digitized intelligence residing on the internet, the collective output of human culture, writing, science, and history, as its raw, co-inherited ingredient.
So what's the solution?
A technosphere commons trust would impose fees on large language model developers for using this massive collective asset. It's essentially charging for the use of human patrimony. This wealth would then circulate back to content creators and to humanity as a social dividend. The sources suggest that this policy might constrain the extractive economics of big tech, shrinking the gross margins of companies like Meta from 80% down to, say, 40%, and recirculating billions to humanity, thereby incentivizing non-extractive business models.
So transformation requires shifting our perception and overcoming massive institutional inertia. The sources describe this shift in terms of leaping over two major intellectual and ideological fences.
The first fence was that intellectual leap made by early ecological economists like Herman Daly, recognizing the limits to growth and the material boundaries imposed by the laws of physics on a finite planet. This awareness is necessary, but if we stop there, we're left only with managing scarcity.
And the second fence is the higher, more profound leap, moving into the regenerative paradigm, moving beyond the Newtonian paradigm and materialism entirely.
Exactly. This requires embracing the scientific fact that life is emergent, creative, intelligent, and abundant. It means moving beyond a fear-based focus on managing scarcity and embracing the challenge of creating the conditions for systemic health. The Polycrisis is the evolutionary pressure forcing this metamorphosis. The old system is unstable and it's breaking down, clearing the ground for the new.
So what acts as the chief obstacle? The system's active immune response that's fighting against this necessary transformation.
The finance algorithm, this is the ideology, the reductionist metrics, the models, and the logic net present value calculations, maximizing shareholder value, that drive nearly all economic decision-making today. It acts like an autoimmune disease.
How so?
It's sophisticated, but it's fundamentally based on flawed logic. It cannot distinguish between healthy, value-creating activity in the real economy and parasitic extractive speculation. And so it attacks both, ultimately attacking the host economy itself.
It's that constant, unconstrained demand for more and never enough that reinforces the myth of separation.
It is. The speculative financial system, which Keynes famously called a whirlpool of speculation, reinforces that Newtonian myth of separation, and it drives the polycrisis. It is perfectly designed for extracting short-term gain, but is completely maladapted to managing long-term complex vitality.
So if transformation is emergent and it can't be willed into being by top-down central planning, how do we achieve it?
We have to follow the wisdom that transformation happens by creating conditions for health and removing obstacles. The analogy is critical here. A farmer doesn't try to force the water to flow uphill or compel it to irrigate the crops.
Right.
The farmer removes a barrier, a boulder, a blockage, allowing the irrigation to flow freely where it naturally wants to go. Our focus must shift from setting impossible top-down targets to identifying and eliminating the system's fatal flaws, primarily those codified within the finance algorithm and the absence of the commons institution.
Okay, let's now move into a detailed discussion of the essential, non-incremental, system-level policy proposals that are required for true transformation. These are the barriers we need to remove.
We start with the institutional fix. 1. Stand up the institution of the commons. This is job 1. It starts by tackling the most urgent commons, like the atmosphere, the internet, and AI data. We have to immediately begin setting science-based quotas where appropriate and recirculating the abundance generated by their use through dividends. This creates a powerful, inequality-neutralizing economic structure right at the foundation of the economy.
Next, directly targeting that immune system of finance. 2. Shrink and rewire the financial sector.
The purpose of finance has to be radically redefined to explicitly serve life and the real economy, not just speculation. This is a massive job. It means curtailing speculative crypto and financial excesses, perhaps via a global financial transaction tax to slow the velocity of destructive speculation. It also means actively incentivizing smaller, more local, resilient, and non-extractive banks that are genuinely place-sourced and relational, rather than maintaining these massive systemic global banks that operate with an inherent extractive logic.
And to address the structural harm of extreme concentration. 3. Implement progressive tax reform.
This is so critical because, as we established, restraining excessive concentration is a scientific requirement for systemic vitality. This requires restraining the creation of exponential fortunes through measures like wealth taxes, aggressively graduated inheritance taxes above a set threshold, and windfall profits taxes. These measures aren't just for revenue generation, they are mechanisms to prevent the destabilization caused by power and capital concentrating excessively.
For changing the fundamental nature of the economic actors themselves. 4. Reinvent corporate governance and ownership.
The fiduciary duty of corporations has to be legally shifted away from maximizing shareholder value to prioritizing systemic health. to stakeholder primacy. This requires expanding models like employee ownership and utilizing purpose trusts, like the one used by Patagonia, which institutionalizes the alignment of the company with its ecological values, making them legally binding and permanent. This removes the existential pressure to always sacrifice long-term health for short-term financial extraction.
Let's discuss leveraging the public sector as a powerful engine for demand shift. 6. Align public procurement and investment.
The public sector is, globally, the world's largest consumer. It has to use its immense purchasing power to shift market demand decisively. This means channeling massive, necessary investment toward 100% renewables and regenerative food systems. When the state, the military, schools, and hospitals only buy regenerative products and services, it immediately provides the massive, long-term market signal that transformative investment requires, stabilizing the new system.
For measuring success, we have to change the metrics. 9. Develop new metrics of systemic health.
We have to move beyond simplistic, extractive metrics like GDP and quarterly profits, which only measure throughput. We need to focus on intrinsic measures, like a doctor monitoring blood pressure or heart rate. These new metrics must monitor the conditions for health in the system, like wealth inequality constraints, ecosystem vitality indices, social capital accumulation, and levels of citizen participation. These are the leading indicators of true vitality, not just lagging outcomes.
And finally, a very profound concept that acts as a structural choke point. 10. Study the limits to investment.
This is about recognizing that trade-offs exist and they have to be managed consciously. If we accept the laws of thermodynamics, we have to accept that some unwise, high-energy, high-material throughput investments must be constrained because they harm the health of the whole. The Commons Institution can act as that choke point.
For instance,
For example, imposing fees or constraints on unchecked, highly energy-intensive AI development. If that development accelerates ecological collapse or structural unemployment, it ensures that the system serves life rather than merely serving its own growth logic. This is the regenerative equivalent of saying, just because we can build it doesn't mean we should.
that list provides a really concrete map of the barriers we need to remove. But this all sounds enormous. The sources, though, they offer a powerful, hopeful perspective on how this change actually manifests in complex systems.
They cite Ilya Prigozhin's chaos theory, which offers immense agency. He said, when a complex system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to shift the entire system to a higher order.
Small islands of coherence.
Our system, the global economy, is profoundly unstable and far from equilibrium. This instability, while terrifying, means that small collaborative efforts, islands of coherence, whether they're B Corp, regenerative farms, bioregional governance projects, or purpose-driven finance initiatives, they matter immensely. Working collaboratively in these islands has the power to shift the entire trajectory, even if we can't see the direct cause and effect, because the system is primed for transformation.
What we've covered today is, well, nothing short of a scientific and moral imperative. The fundamental shift from a reductionist, machine-centered worldview rooted in separation to an ecological, holistic one rooted in interdependence. The Polycrisis is not just a disaster, it's the immense pressure forcing the civilizational metamorphosis, the necessary pressure that weakens the structural bonds of the old, unworkable system.
And the scientific implications of this new worldview are truly breathtaking. Since the deep interdependence of all life is settled science, reaffirmed by physics discoveries like quantum entanglement, it means that our individual agency is far greater than the mechanistic worldview ever allowed us to believe.
What we do, what we choose not to do, and critically, the intentions we set, the relational choices we make every single day, will affect the outcome of this historic moment. We are not passive passengers. We are active co-creators in an evolutionary design process that will determine the future of life on this planet.
And that brings us to the ultimate wisdom, articulated by the great system thinker Dana Meadows, which sits even above paradigm shift in the hierarchy of leverage points. We must remain unattached to any single paradigm. We must realize that no paradigm is the ultimate truth, especially not even the regenerative one. We have to maintain profound humility and realize that the universe, life, and the capacity for emergence are far beyond human comprehension. That humility is essential when you're undertaking such a grand design process.
So, since this transformation is emergent and unknowable, we don't know what the butterfly looks like yet. And since our current degenerative economy is ultimately an expression of a deeply flawed human identity rooted in separation and scarcity, here is a final thought for you to carry forward wherever you are operating in the economy.
What new identity rooted in interconnectedness, insufficiency, and in right relationship would allow you to start changing the dream in your own life and contribute to the emergence of a regenerative civilization? Because that shift in identity, not just a policy change, is where the great work of our time truly begins.